If someone had told me a year ago that the man I considered my personal nemesis, the source of all auditory and existential pain in my life, would become its center, I would have recommended they get their hearing checked. My life was a carefully curated library of quiet routines and predictable chapters. I was the archivist of my own solitude, and I liked it that way. Or I had convinced myself I did. His name was Julian, and his medium was noise. He was the lead contractor on the library's restoration project. For 6 months, my sanctuary of silent study and whispered requests had been under siege. The rhythmic thunder of hammers, the high-pitched scream of a power saw cutting through stone, the gravelly shouts of men in dusty boots. These were the sounds that bled through the thick walls and into my meticulously ordered days. And Julian was the conductor of this cacophony. I watched him from the tall, arched window of the special collections room. He was a man built of broad shoulders and solid lines, moving with an economy of motion that was both efficient and infuriatingly confident. His hair was a dark, unruly mess, perpetually damp with sweat at the temples. His arms, corded with muscle and dusted with a fine layer of white powder, were cartography of old scars and new scrapes. He was a physical fact, a loud, unavoidable presence in a world I had built entirely out of whispers and shadows. I cataloged him the way I cataloged my manuscripts, by observable data. Height, over 6 feet. Build, imposing. Demeanor, a kind of casual arrogance. The way he'd prop a boot on a stack of lumber and survey his work, a king in a kingdom of chaos. I decided I disliked him intensely. It was a clean, simple emotion, an easy one to file away. Dislike was safe. Dislike asked for nothing. Our interactions were minimal, clipped. A curt nod in the hallway. A tight-lipped, "excuse me," as I tried to navigate past a ladder or a pile of debris. He smelled of sawdust and something metallic like rain on hot asphalt. The scent clung to the air long after he'd passed. An olfactory ghost I couldn't exorcise. It was an invasion. Everything about him was an invasion. My days were measured in the rise and fall of his work. The blessed quiet of the early morning before his crew arrived. The slow escalation of noise until the lunch break, a brief 30-minute armistice. Then the afternoon assault, culminating in the final, shuddering silence when they packed up and left for the day. That silence was the best part of my day. It felt like a fever breaking. I would sit at my desk, eyes closed, and just breathe it in, letting it scrub his presence from the air. The distance between us was more than just professional. It was elemental. I was paper and ink. He was steel and stone. I was the quiet interior. He was the loud, chaotic world outside. I built my life on the preservation of the past, on the careful handling of fragile things. He built his by tearing things down and raising them up again, stronger, louder, newer. We were opposing forces, and I was certain we were meant to occupy entirely different orbits. Then came the rain. It wasn't just rain. It was a biblical deluge, the kind of storm that turns the sky a bruised purple-gray and unleashes a fury that feels personal. It started in the afternoon, a steady drumming that quickly escalated into a roar. The lights in the library flickered once, twice, then held steady, but the mood had shifted. The few remaining patrons packed their bags and hurried out into the downpour, leaving me and a handful of staff behind. By 5 o'clock, the city was surrendering. News alerts buzzed on my phone. Flash flood warnings, street closures, public transit suspended indefinitely. The library director, a woman whose unflappable demeanor could withstand budget cuts and irate donors, looked out the grand front doors and declared us officially stranded. My routine was shattered. My carefully planned evening, a quiet walk home, a simple dinner, a book, was washed away. Panic, cold and slick, began to creep up my spine. I hated disruptions. I hated the unpredictable. My apartment, my fortress of solitude, was miles away, an impossible distance across a drowning city. I saw him through the glass of the main reading room. Julian. He was talking to his crew, gesturing at the sheets of rain, his expression grim. One by one, they left, running to their trucks, until only he remained. He stood under the portico, staring out at the storm, his shoulders slumped in a way I'd never seen before. A crack in the confident facade. For a moment, he wasn't the arrogant contractor. He was just a man, trapped by the weather, same as me. The director arranged for a few of us to sleep on cots in the staff lounge, but the thought of it made my skin crawl. The forced intimacy, the snoring, the stale air. It felt like a special kind of prison. I was gathering my things, resigning myself to a long, uncomfortable night when he appeared in the doorway of my office. He was dripping wet, his hair plastered to his forehead. The ever-present layer of dust had been washed away, and in the dim library light, his face looked younger, starker. "They shut the bridges," he said. His voice was lower without the surrounding clamor of his work, a rough baritone that seemed to vibrate in the suddenly silent room. I just nodded, my throat tight. "My place is just a few blocks from here," he continued, shoving his hands into the pockets of his jeans. It was an awkward, hesitant gesture, so unlike him. "The apartment above the workshop. It's not much, still a mess, but it's dry. And there's a couch." The offer hung in the air between us. A lifeline I didn't want to take. My mind screamed no. Go to the staff room. Endure the cots. Stay in your world. But my body, weary and cold, was already betraying me. The thought of a couch, even in his space, was a siren song. "I don't want to impose," I managed, the words feeling stiff and formal. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "The city's underwater. I think we're past imposing." He looked at me, his gaze direct, and for the first time, I felt like he was actually seeing me, not just the quiet obstacle in the hallway. "It's better than a cot, right?" And so, I found myself following my nemesis out into the storm, my small world irrevocably breached. The walk was a frantic, waterlogged ordeal. We ran, heads bowed against the wind, under his one large, battered umbrella. The sound of the rain on the taut fabric was deafening. I could feel the heat radiating from his body next to mine, a stark contrast to the icy water soaking through my shoes. His workshop was on a side street, a large, unassuming brick building. A heavy steel door led to a flight of wooden stairs, worn smooth with age and use. His apartment was exactly as he described it. A mess. It was one large, open-plan room with high ceilings and enormous windows that were currently being assaulted by the storm. Tools were stacked in corners. Blueprints were spread across a large drafting table, and the air smelled of fresh-cut wood, paint thinner, and damp concrete. It was the smell of him, concentrated, but it was dry and warm. "Like I said, it's a work in progress," he said, running a hand through his wet hair, sending a spray of droplets onto the floor. "The kitchen works, mostly, and the bathroom." He gestured to a worn, oversized leather couch. "That's all yours." I stood awkwardly by the door, dripping onto a floor already littered with wood shavings. I felt like a misplaced comma in a sentence that didn't need me. This was his space, his chaos. It was aggressively masculine, functional, and utterly devoid of the soft, quiet things I used to build my own comfort. "Let me get you a towel," he said, disappearing into what I assumed was the bathroom. He returned with two. They were thick and gray and smelled faintly of bleach. He handed one to me, his fingers brushing against mine as I took it. The touch was nothing. An accident. A fleeting connection of skin. But my body registered it as a jolt, a low-voltage shock that traveled up my arm and settled, hot and heavy, in my chest. My heart, a frantic, trapped bird, hammered against my ribs. I snatched my hand back as if burned. Did he notice? I risked a glance at his face. He was busy drying his own hair, his expression unreadable. Of course he didn't notice. To him, it was just a touch. To me, it was a cataclysm. I mumbled a thank you and focused on drying my own hair, the rough terry cloth a welcome distraction. I started to notice the details of the room, the things you don't see from a distance. A row of well-tended succulents on a windowsill. A stack of novels on a small end table. Worn paperbacks, not the pristine hardcovers I was used to. A framed photograph of him with an older woman, both of them grinning, squinting in the sun. These were small, human details. Chinks in the armor of the loud, arrogant contractor I had constructed in my mind. He wasn't just a collection of noises and imposing gestures. He was a person who read books and kept plants and loved his mother. The thought was deeply unsettling. It complicated my clean, simple dislike. "You're shivering," he observed, his voice pulling me from my thoughts. "I'll make some coffee. Or tea. I think I have tea. Coffee is fine," I said, my own voice sounding thin. I watched him move around the small, makeshift kitchen. His movements were still efficient, still confident, but here, in his own space, they seemed different. Less like a performance, more like a habit. He handled the coffee maker with a familiarity that was almost gentle. I noticed the way his shirt, damp from the rain, clung to the muscles of his back. I noticed a long, faded scar that ran from his left shoulder blade down towards his spine. I wondered how he got it. I wondered who had tended to the wound. He brought over 2 steaming mugs. They were heavy, ceramic, mismatched. He handed one to me, careful this time not to touch my hand. I wrapped my cold fingers around the warm ceramic, the heat a welcome anchor in the swirling sea of my anxiety. We sat in silence for a few moments, him in a sturdy wooden chair, me on the edge of the enormous couch. The only sound were the storm raging outside and the quiet sip of coffee. The silence was different here. It wasn't the blessed, empty silence of a library after he'd left. This was a shared silence, thick with unspoken things. It was a physical weight. "So," he said, breaking it, "you're the guy in the basement," I bristled. "It's called the Special Collections Archive." He almost smiled, a faint upward tick at the corner of his mouth. "Right. The dungeon of dusty books." He took a sip of his coffee. "You really hate the noise, don't you?" It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact, a simple observation. "It's distracting," I said, my defensiveness automatic. "My work requires concentration." "Yeah, I get it." He leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. He looked tired. The lines around his eyes were deeper than I'd ever noticed. The relentless energy he projected at the worksite was gone, replaced by a profound weariness. "This whole project has been a nightmare. Delays, supply issues, the City Heritage Board breathing down my neck about every single brick," he was complaining. He was showing a sliver of vulnerability, and it changed everything. The power dynamic, which had always felt so skewed, him the strong, loud force of nature, me the quiet, retreating academic, was suddenly leveling out. He wasn't just the cause of my frustration. He had frustrations of his own. Just then, the lights flickered violently and died, plunging the room into absolute darkness. The roar of the storm seemed to intensify, rushing in to fill the void left by the electric hum. I flinched, a small, involuntary gasp escaping my lips. I hated the dark. Another disruption. Another loss of control. "Damn it," Julian muttered. A scraping sound. Then the narrow beam of his phone's flashlight cut through the black. It swept across the room, catching the wild dance of dust motes in its beam, before settling on his own face, illuminating it from below. "Stay put. I have candles somewhere." He moved carefully through the cluttered space, his flashlight beam a roving spotlight. I could hear him rummaging in a drawer, the clatter of metal on metal. I sat perfectly still on the couch, my mug of coffee clutched in my hands like a talisman. My heart was doing that frantic bird thing again. The darkness felt immense, the room both larger and more claustrophobic than it had with the lights on. "Found them," he announced. A moment later, the warm, flickering glow of a candle flame bloomed in the center of the room, followed by another and another. He placed them on the coffee table, the drafting table, a bookshelf. The candlelight pushed back the oppressive darkness, replacing it with a world of soft edges and long, dancing shadows. It was intimate, dangerously intimate. He turned to put his phone down and misjudged the edge of a toolbox on the floor. He stumbled, catching himself on the drafting table, but not before letting out a sharp hiss of pain. "Are you all right?" I asked, my voice tight with alarm. "Yeah, Fine." Just he trailed off, looking down at his hand. In the candlelight, I could see a dark line of blood welling up from a gash across his palm. He'd caught it on a sharp piece of metal. Great. Just what I needed. He walked over to the kitchen sink and ran it under the tap, hissing again as the water hit the open wound. He was trying to inspect it, twisting his hand at an awkward angle. "I can't see it properly," he said, his voice tight with frustration. And that's when the world tilted. He was the strong one, the capable one, the one who could build walls and fix anything. But right now, he was hurt, and he was fumbling in the dark. And I, the quiet man from the basement, the one who dealt in paper and glue, knew what to do. My sister was a nurse. I picked up a thing or two. "Let me see," I said, the words coming out with a surprising firmness. I stood up and moved towards him. He looked at me, his expression a mixture of surprise and pain. For a second, I thought he would refuse, that his pride wouldn't allow it. But then he just nodded, a short, sharp jerk of his head, and held out his hand. I took his hand in mine. His skin was rough, calloused but warm. So warm. His hand was huge, dwarfing my own. The cut was deep, clean, but bleeding freely. I led him over to the couch and sat him down, my movements suddenly sure and steady. The archivist in me took over. This was a problem to be solved, a fragile thing that needed mending. "Do you have a first aid kit?" I asked, my voice calm. My internal panic had been silenced by the immediate need for action. "Bathroom cabinet." Under the sink, I found it, a small, dusty plastic box. I brought it back, along with a clean towel. I knelt on the floor in front of him, the candlelight casting our shadows, large and distorted, on the wall behind us. I took his hand again, gently this time, and began to clean the wound with an antiseptic wipe. He flinched but didn't pull away. I worked in silence, my focus narrowed to the task at hand. The scent of antiseptic mixed with the smell of his skin, of rain and sawdust. I could feel his eyes on me, watching my every move. The room was so quiet. I could hear his breathing, slow and steady. I was so close to him, kneeling at his feet like a supplicant. The intimacy of the moment was staggering, a physical pressure in my chest. I was touching him, willingly. I was caring for him. After cleaning the wound, I carefully applied a butterfly bandage to pull the edges together, then wrapped his palm in a layer of gauze. My fingers brushed against his wrist, feeling the strong, steady thrum of his pulse. My own was a frantic, chaotic mess. "There," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I secured the bandage and finally looked up at him. His face was only inches from mine. The candlelight carved deep shadows under his cheekbones and softened the hard lines of his jaw. His eyes, which I had always seen as a cold, distant gray, were a complex storm of green and brown in the warm light. He wasn't looking at his hand. He was looking at me, and there was a look in his eyes I had never seen before. A raw, unguarded vulnerability. "Thank you," he said, his voice a low rumble. The air between us grew thick, charged. The storm outside seemed to fade into a distant murmur. All that existed was the flickering candlelight, the scent of antiseptic, and the overwhelming proximity of him. I should have moved away. I should have stood up, retreated to my side of the room, and rebuilt the careful distance between us. I didn't move. I couldn't. "Leo," he said, and the sound of my own name on his lips was a revelation. He'd never used it before. It had always been you, or just a curt nod. My breath hitched. My entire world had shrunk to this single point in time, to the space between his exhale and my inhale. He started to speak, stopped, then started again. "I see you," he said, his voice rough with an emotion I couldn't name. "In the library. You're always watching from that window. I thought you hated me." The confession hung in the air, a fragile, trembling thing. "I don't hate you," I whispered, and it was the truest thing I had ever said. The dislike had been a shield, a flimsy piece of armor to protect me from the far more terrifying alternative. The noise. It was just a lot. He let out a soft, breathy laugh. "Yeah, I'm a lot." He shifted his weight, leaning slightly closer. His uninjured hand came up, slow, hesitant, and cupped my jaw. His thumb, calloused and rough, stroked my cheek. The touch was electric, a wildfire that raced through every nerve in my body. "I'm sorry," he said. "For the noise." I shook my head, my throat too tight for words. This wasn't about the noise anymore. It had never really been about the noise. He searched my eyes, his own full of a question he didn't seem to know how to ask. And in that moment, I realized I was tired of the silence. My own silence. Tired of living behind walls, both literal and metaphorical. So I leaned in, just a fraction of an inch. But it was enough. It was the answer to his unspoken question. His eyes fluttered shut, and he closed the remaining distance between us. His lips met mine. It wasn't a frantic, passionate kiss. It was slow, questioning. It was hesitant and unbelievably gentle. His mouth was soft, warm, tasting of coffee and rain. His stubble was a rough, pleasant abrasion against my skin. I brought my hand up to his chest, feeling the solid, steady beat of his heart beneath my palm. It was just as frantic as my own. He wasn't the confident, arrogant contractor anymore, and I wasn't the timid, reclusive archivist. We were just two people in a dark room with a storm raging outside, finding a different kind of shelter in each other. He pulled back slightly, resting his forehead against mine. His breath was warm on my face. Leo, he breathed out, as if the name itself was a discovery. And in the flickering candlelight, surrounded by his chaos, I finally felt quiet. I woke to the unfamiliar sensation of sunlight on my face. Bright, unforgiving morning light. The storm had broken. The apartment was silent, save for the distant sound of city traffic slowly returning to life. I was on a couch, alone. A thick wool blanket was tucked around me, one I didn't remember from the night before. For a confused, dreamlike moment, I felt a sense of peace. Then memory crashed back in. The candles, the confession, the kiss. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the sleepy warmth. My stomach filled with a swarm of angry bees. What had I done? The room looked different in the daylight. The romantic, shadowy intimacy of a night was gone, replaced by the harsh reality of a cluttered, half-finished workspace. The candle stubs sat on the table, small monuments to a moment of madness. It all felt like a dream, a reckless, impossible dream. Julian was nowhere to be seen. A note was propped against a coffee mug on the table. My heart hammered against my ribs as I reached for it. His handwriting was a strong, angular script. Went to check on the site. Coffee's fresh. Help yourself, that was it. No mention of the night before. No, we need to talk. Just a brutally practical, impersonal message. It was a dismissal. A clean, efficient severing. Of course. What had I expected? He was a man of action, of hammers and nails, not of quiet feelings and hesitant kisses in the dark. Last night was a fluke. A storm-induced anomaly. My carefully constructed world, which had been so thoroughly dismantled, was now rushing back in, and it brought with it shame and regret. I was the quiet man from the basement. I had rules. I had routines. I didn't get stranded in storms and kiss my nemesis. I had stepped so far out of my own life that I couldn't even see the way back. I had to leave. Now, before he came back, before I had to face the awkward, pitying look in his eyes. I couldn't bear it. I folded the blanket neatly and placed it at the end of the couch. I didn't touch the coffee. I gathered my damp clothes and my worn briefcase, my armor of professionalism, and slipped out of the apartment, closing the door behind me with a soft, final click. The walk back to my own apartment was a blur. The city was a mess of fallen branches and overflowing storm drains, but the sun was shining with a cruel cheerfulness. It felt like it was mocking me. The silence that followed was worse than any noise he had ever made. For 2 days, I existed in a state of suspended animation. I went to work. I sat in my archive. I tried to focus on the familiar comfort of cataloging and preservation. But everything was tainted. The silence of the library no longer felt peaceful. It felt empty. It was an absence, a Julian-shaped hole in the world. The construction noises started up again on the 3rd day, but they were different. I could no longer hear them as a single, unified cacophony. I could pick out the individual sounds, but the one I was listening for, his voice, shouting instructions, laughing with his crew, wasn't there. I told myself it was a relief. It was a lie. My solitude, once my greatest comfort, had become a punishment. My quiet apartment felt like a tomb. Every shadow reminded me of the candlelight in his room. Every time it started to rain, my stomach would clench with a hopeless, stupid knot of longing. I replayed the kiss over and over in my mind, analyzing it, dissecting it, until it was nothing but a source of exquisite pain. I had been a fool, an emotional tourist in a land I had no business visiting. I had just resigned myself to this new, hollowed-out version of my life when he appeared. It was late afternoon. I was in the stacks, running my fingers over the spines of old books, trying to ground myself in something real and unchanging. I heard the soft footfalls on the marble floor and turned, expecting a student or a fellow researcher. It was Julian. He was standing at the end of the aisle, looking completely out of place in his dusty work clothes among the towering shelves of leather-bound volumes. He looked hesitant, uncertain. All the easy confidence I had first observed in him was gone. He just stood there, his hands shoved in his pockets, watching me. My heart stopped, then restarted with a painful thud. This was it, the confrontation. He had come to my sanctuary to deliver the final blow, to tell me to forget what happened, to make it clear that it was a mistake. I braced myself. "Leo," he said, and my name was quiet in the vast, silent space. I couldn't speak. I just waited. He walked slowly down the aisle toward me, his boots making no sound on the thick runner. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that I could smell the familiar scent of sawdust and clean sweat. "I'm an idiot," he said. It wasn't the opening line I was expecting. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I was beginning to recognize as a sign of stress. "I woke up that morning, and you were gone. I thought you ran. I figured I'd scared you off. That I pushed too far." I stared at him, my carefully prepared defenses crumbling. "I thought you regretted it." I confessed, the words a choked whisper. The note. It was so impersonal, he finished for me, a pained look on his face. "Yeah, like I said, I'm an idiot. I'm not good at this." He gestured vaguely between us. "Words. Feelings. I build things. I fix things. I don't talk about them." The honesty in his voice was disarming. He looked so lost, so vulnerable, standing there in my world of words, admitting that he had none of his own. I didn't know what to say. He continued, his gaze locked on mine. "Everything I thought of sounded stupid. So I wrote a stupid note and went to work because that's what I know how to do. And when I got back, you were gone. And the last 2 days. They've been the quietest, longest 2 days of my life." His words echoed my own feelings so perfectly that it stole my breath. The Julian-shaped hole. He had felt it too. "I don't regret it, Leo," he said, his voice dropping lower, more intense. "Not for a second. It's the only thing that's made sense in months. But it scared the hell out of me. You scare the hell out of me. I scare you." The idea was ludicrous. I was the scared one. I was the one who ran. "Yes, you," he took a step closer. "The way you look at things so carefully. The way you're so quiet. It makes me feel loud and clumsy. I don't know what I'm doing here. I don't know what this is. But I don't want to go back to just being the noise outside your window." We stood there in the hushed cathedral of the library and laid our fears bare. It was a different kind of confession, more terrifying and more honest than the one in the dark. It was a conversation held in the full light of day, with no storm to blame it on. I finally found my voice. "I don't want to go back either." A slow smile spread across his face, and it was like the sun coming out after the rain. The relief was so profound it made me feel lightheaded. He reached into his pocket and pulled something out. A single key on a simple metal ring. He held it out to me. "This isn't for the workshop," he said. "It's for my actual apartment. The finished one. On the other side of town." He pressed the key into my palm. It was cool and solid, a tangible weight. "For the next time it rains," he said, his voice soft. "Or for whenever. Just so you don't have to run." It was a promise. An anchor. An offer not just of shelter, but of a place. A place with him. I closed my fingers around the key, the metal edges digging into my skin. It was the most real thing I had ever held. "Okay," I said. It was the only word I needed. The noise didn't stop. The construction continued. The saws still screamed. The hammers still fell. But it was different now. It was no longer the sound of an invasion. It was the sound of Julian's world, a world I was slowly, tentatively being invited into. It became a kind of music, the soundtrack to the slow, careful construction of something new between us. The mornings are my favorite part. I wake up now not to a sterile silence, but to the soft sound of another person breathing in the room. I wake up to the smell of coffee already brewing, a scent now inextricably linked with warmth and safety. I wake up in his bed, in his finished apartment, a space filled with comfortable, well-worn furniture and the same row of succulents, now thriving in the morning sun. This morning, I watched him from the doorway of the kitchen. He was standing at the counter, shirtless, wearing a pair of faded gray sweatpants. The long scar on his back was pale in the soft light. He was focused on pouring coffee into those same two mismatched mugs, his movements as efficient and sure as they were on a job site. He sensed me watching and turned, a slow, easy smile on his face. "Morning," he said, his voice still rough with sleep. "Morning," I replied, walking over to him. The cold kitchen tiles were a shock against my bare feet. I wrapped my arms around his waist from behind, resting my cheek against the warmth of his back. I felt the solid muscle contract under my touch. He leaned back into me, his hand coming up to cover mine where it rested on his stomach. We stood like that for a long moment in a comfortable, shared silence. This silence wasn't a wait. It wasn't an absence. It was a space we had built together, a quiet room in the midst of a loud world. He turned to my arms and handed me a mug. Our fingers brushed, and this time, there was no jolt of panic, only a familiar, pleasant warmth. He leaned down and kissed me, a soft, sleepy morning kiss that tasted of coffee and the promise of a day that we would face together. I used to believe that my life was a rare, fragile manuscript that had to be protected at all costs, kept safe from the disruptions of the outside world. I built my own archive, cataloged my solitude, and called it peace. Julian was the storm I never saw coming. He was the plot twist, the unexpected chapter that ripped the binding and rewrote the entire story. He didn't just breach the walls of my quiet life. He demolished them, and then, with his strong, calloused, gentle hands, he built something new and far more beautiful in their place. It turns out I didn't come to the ranch looking for love. I didn't even know what a ranch was. Wait, that's not right. I need to fix that. Let me rephrase. I didn't go to the library looking for love. I went there for the quiet. I went there for the safety of the known. But a rainy night led me to a shelter I wasn't seeking, and in the heart of the storm, I found a home. I suppose it makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many of us build walls to keep the storm out, not realizing the storm is the only thing that can set us free? What beautiful disruptions have you allowed into your own carefully curated life? It's a question worth pondering, I think, in the quiet moments.